Okay, welcome back to our third and final video in this topic numbered 4.8. We're looking at President Andrew Jackson and his exercise of federal authority. So this final video, we're going to be looking at Jackson's Native American policy, which is going to feature a power struggle between the executive branch and the Supreme Court. And then we'll finish up the video by discussing the legacies of Andrew Jackson. So what changed because of his presidency, and what by the end of it, how would we define Jacksonian democracy? So let's take a look at this Native American policy. A major facet of this Native American policy on the part of Jackson is that he wanted Indian removal from Eastern lands. So the major motivator in this is to remove Native Americans from the southeast, like move them into the southwest, to provide land for Southern planters who are needing new land because they've exhausted theirs growing cotton. So in 1830, Andrew Jackson gives a speech signaling his intention to pursue Indian removal. And then later that year, the Indian Removal Act is passed by Congress. And this Indian Removal Act is targeted to the 5 civilized tribes. So we're looking at Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. I'll show you a map in a little bit that shows that the traditional territories of these tribes. The one that is most referenced when we talk about this Indian removal is the Cherokee, because it was the Cherokee tribes that attempted to fight this removal in the courts. And so that's what sets up this battle between President Jackson and the Supreme Court. Okay, so I'm going to go into 2 court cases. We've got Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which occurred in 1831. And the finding there is that Native American, tribal groups are a domestic dependent nation, meaning they are sovereign, independent nation, but not fully independent. They're independent within their territories, but because their territory is within the territory of the U.S. government, that makes them dependent on the United States government. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. This is a case that is decided, the finding was that Cherokee law is sovereign and that Georgia law does not apply within the Cherokee Nation's lands. So these 2 court cases are pretty significant. They were considered a win for the Cherokee Nation. Jackson's response to that is, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. So let's see what this means, and we'll come back to this phrasing of John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. So Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. These are the last major cases with John Marshall, by the way. He will retire from the court after these cases, and Jackson is going to replace John Marshall with a man named Roger B. Taney or Tawney. I've heard people pronounce it 2 different ways. I always heard Taney growing up. But in Marshall's decision, what's happening with Cherokee Nation versus Georgia is that the Cherokee tribes are trying to keep the state of Georgia from taking over or trampling on their authority within their lands. So what's happening is the state of Georgia is trying to remove the Cherokee from their lands, and there are prior treaties in place with the federal government. So the Cherokee Nation goes to court and they say Georgia has no right to remove us because we are, we have prior treaties. And so this is the important finding that came out of this court case. So John Marshall writes the opinion, and what he says is that the conditions of the Indians in relation to the United States is perhaps unlike that of any 2 people in existence. He says their relation to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian. So they were a domestic dependent nation. Okay, and what that means then is that if we follow this decision in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Marshall says there's an established trust relationship with the tribes directly under federal authority. So it's a win in the sense that Georgia, as a state, cannot act upon the tribes, right? So they can't enforce Georgia law within tribal territories, or try to remove from their land. Okay, but one of the hard things about these court cases is, Marshall's made his decision, but the Supreme Court doesn't have enforcement power, right? The Supreme Court then has to rely on Congress or the president to enforce the findings of the court. So there's a follow-up case after Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and this one is Worcester versus Georgia. Now, this is surrounding the arrest of a Cherokee man on Cherokee lands by Georgia state officials, right? So that's Worcester. And what this case basically established with the finding is that that tribes have autonomy within their boundaries. Right, so this is the case that establishes the concept of tribal autonomy, that tribes are a self-governing state or community within their boundaries. And so the quote from the case basically says, these tribes are distinct political communities having territorial boundaries within which their authority is exclusive. So the arrest of a Cherokee person for violating Georgia law inside of Cherokee boundaries is what Marshall found to be unconstitutional. So the court rules that the laws of Georgia do not have force within the territorial boundaries of the Cherokee Nation. And again, these decisions, it's hard to enforce by the court because it's not like the court has a police force or something to make sure this is followed. Once the court reviews the law and states what the law is, they then rely on the executive branch to enforce those decisions. So this is where we get into Jackson saying, John Marshall has had his say, now let him enforce it. And so in spite of the wins in the courts, these 5 tribes were forcibly removed from their lands. And so we can see these areas here where the lands were. Okay, the Cherokee were the last because they had been fighting in the court and trying to stop this removal. These tribes were forcibly moved into, kind of what we would call present-day Oklahoma. And they were told that this land would be Indian territory permanently. Okay, so we'll discuss that later. But these tribes were moved into territory that is like ecologically different, geographically different. One interesting thing about these tribes here is that they had largely adopted mainstream ways in terms of politics, right? So they had written constitutions. They had created written languages for their language so that they could actually write. They had a legal code. Many of these, the Cherokee in particular, were practicing plantation agriculture. And they actually had enslaved people working on their plantations. So in economic terms, they were like the rest of this southern region, but this is valuable land. So as we know from the previous topics we studied on slavery in the American South, the system of the American South, these areas, Virginia, North Carolina, the Carolinas and Georgia, the land has been exhausted and plantation owners are needing to move westward. So this looks very valuable and it was taken. So when we look at the Trail of Tears, probably the most famous image that you might see is this painting of the Cherokee people moving with their possessions onto their new lands in Oklahoma. And you can see within here are armed U.S. Army guards overseeing this forced relocation. This painting is way nicer than it actually was. The estimate is that somewhere like 25% to 33% of people on this Cherokee Trail of Tears ended up dying on their relocation. So nearly a third of these people ended up dying. So that is not communicated with this picture here. This looks like a bunch of people moving. You can see, like, by their posture that some of them are, like unhappy, perhaps. This man in traditional dress is appearing very proud, but I don't get any sense of death from this, not in the scale that it occurred. So the Cherokee Trail of Tears is considered one of those tragedies of our history, where people were forcibly moved off of their land, and many died because of it. And then about 50 years later, that territory in Oklahoma was allocated again by the U.S. Army to settlers. So, I just don't feel like this painting tells the real story very well. But if we're looking at Jackson, let me move my face off of here. Jackson's legacy, when we look at his accomplishments, oh, that's interesting. Let's see if I can get these to come down here. All right. So his accomplishments as president are, he did enlarge the power of the presidency. So he used the veto against Congress to enlarge the power of the presidency. He violated or went against the findings of the Supreme Court, and he demonstrated federal supremacy against the states in the nullification crisis. So he enlarged the power of the presidency, and he really kind of created this idea that the president is not responsible to Congress. The president is responsible to the people. He is the first president that really converted the veto into an effective presidential power. So if he did not like something that came out of Congress, he was not shy about using his veto. And with his use of the spoils system or patronage, we begin to see political parties are perceived in this time period as a positive good. So political parties are strengthened through that use of patronage and spoils. So what we see then for Jacksonian democracy is a changed political party system. We have two political parties emerge. So those national Republicans are now the Whigs. Okay, they favor a strong national government. They favor things like the Bank of the U.S., protective tariffs, internal improvements, all these things here. And they believe that the best and the privileged should run the government. They viewed Jackson as dangerous because he was, a common man and not educated and didn't really understand the system. So the Whigs retained some of this elitist view in who should participate in government. And then Jackson's party, the Democrats, they believe in states' rights, federal restraint in economic and social affairs, which is interesting because Jackson's restraint led to the collapse of the economy. So it's very interesting to study some of this. They also believe that the liberty of the individual, or in the liberty of the individual, right? So individual freedom. And this party is on guard against any kind of perception that there's privilege within the government. So things like this elitist view that the Whigs take. They believe that is privilege, that's giving undue influence to the rich, and that it's everybody, the common people, that should run government. And this party is pro-slavery. Okay, and so here we come to kind of the bottom one. They want to protect the common man and see a government of the common man. So this is what we would call the second political party system. And then, if we want to look at Jackson's failures, what we do see in society, and this is, with the lens of history, is that during Jackson's presidency, there was growing social stratification, which means an increasing in the levels of people based on wealth. So there's going to be a widening gap between the rich and the poor that we can see emerge during Jackson's presidency. Okay, so the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And Jackson's financial policies, especially surrounding the National Bank, led to that Panic of 1837, which was a very serious depression in the country. It lasted until 1843. It actually led to or it's often pointed to as the reason that Jackson's successor in the presidency only served one term. So, it looks like I have that that slide twice. Okay, so Jackson's successor. Jackson's presidency ends, with this widened or growing influence of the president or power of the president. And so Jackson's successor is Martin Van Buren, who had been the vice president for Jackson during his second term. So Martin Van Buren is a Democrat. His nickname is Old Kinderhook. I am not sure where that comes from, so we should definitely look it up on Google and see where that comes from. But Van Buren runs on the same kind of party platform as Jackson. He uses the platform that we saw in the previous slide for the Democrats. And you can see, he wins pretty handily. So he gained a majority in the popular vote by just a little bit. And then his majority in the electoral vote was, pretty handy, 57%. So when we look at this map here of his electoral wins, we can see that he is favored in the West. And then he he's favored in the West, and he is also favored in New York and Pennsylvania. This guy is also called, besides Old Kinderhook, they call him the Little Magician. And many credit him as being the architect of political parties in this time period. He was the one who saw political parties as the path to power. So the growth of political parties is often credited to Martin Van Buren. But in his presidency, Martin Van Buren was hampered by the Panic of 1837. So he had a terrible economy. People were suffering. Their land was getting repossessed. And so when he runs for re-election, he loses to the former opponent, William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig. William Henry Harrison was another general who became famous from the War of 1812. And as a Whig, William Henry Harrison is like an Eastern guy. He's an elite, but he did learn that the way to win is to kind of frame himself as more of a common man. So he takes the campaign strategies of Jackson and Van Buren, and he runs his election in 1840. It's called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider election. Okay, so these terms are supposed to show us like the common man. So people lived in these log cabins out on the frontier, and hard cider is the kind of drink they would make. So they would use fruit from their harvest and turn it into an alcoholic cider. And so it was like also a common person's drink. So log cabin and hard cider was the kind of the approach. They use the phrase Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So Tippecanoe is the name of the battle that William Henry Harrison was famous for winning. It was a battle in the West against Native Americans. So Tippecanoe, and then Tyler too is John Tyler. He is the man who's running as vice president with Harrison. And then another phrase they used was Van is a used up man. So Martin Van Buren is a used up man. So the Whigs win. They've learned how to run a campaign from Jackson. When Harrison takes office, he was insecure about his age. He was an old man by the time he won the presidency. So he wanted to show that he was still vigorous and strong. So he rode his horse into Washington, D.C., rather than riding in a carriage. And it was like a rainy, gross, wet winter day when he rode into Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. And then he gave like a 3-hour-long speech and caught pneumonia, and he died 40 days into his presidency. So I guess the lesson from William Henry Harrison is do not give a 3-hour-long speech on a cold, wet day in Washington, D.C. if you are an old man. So he wasn't president for a long time, but he had learned how to run a campaign from Jackson. So this kind of is where we're going to pause in terms of political history. We'll come back because the next election in 1844 is extremely significant. So we'll come back, but 1844 is manifest destiny. So we're just going to pause here on our political history for a little bit, and we're going to turn to social history, and we're going to be looking at religion in this time period, this first half of the 18th century. Like, how did this expansion of democracy end up being reflected in religion? And then we're going to see also some reform movements come to be because of this expansion of democracy and religion and everything. So this is where we pause on political history. If you are stopping to go over your notes here, you want to make sure you have some specifics about that Native American policy, and then you're looking just globally at what happened. Here, I'll put myself in here. So you're just looking like globally, the whole picture of Andrew Jackson's presidency. And the answer with Andrew Jackson is he expanded presidential power. So make sure that you definitely know that political cartoon of King Andrew. I have seen that political cartoon, I think, on every single APUSH test in some way, shape, or form. So happy studying, APUSH. Have a good one. I'll see you on the next video.